Friday, sunny but cool afternoon. We're happy to be here. So today we're hearing from Dr. Christina Diaz as part of our Turbeville speaker series, and her title of her talk is Moving Beyond the Salmon Bias, Assessing Health Selection Among Mexican Migrants. And I'm particularly interested in this because she will be talking about how even though Mexican migrants tend to have lower socioeconomic status and less access to health care, often they report better health outcomes. So that kind of contradiction is something that's really worthwhile exploring more, and something that we're looking at with the Latino Families Research Consortium, which is a combo between ASU and U of A. So as you guys know, FMI is honoring Frances McClellan, who really personified that sort of resiliency within families and overcoming disabilities. She was a very successful businesswoman here in Tucson and really throughout Arizona. And we do have her favorite candies here, so make sure you get one of the Little C's candies. And we always want to thank Pamela Turbeville for supporting our speaker series. She's a U of A alumni and has always been really supportive of the Norden School. So today we have Dr. Christina Diaz, who's here with us from the School of Sociology. She's relatively new to the University of Arizona. She's an assistant professor, joined us last year. And her background is sociology with a concentration in demography. And she came to us from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her research is focused on international migration, social stratification, and processes of family formation. So I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thanks. Let me see here. I am a Mac user, so do bear with me. Thank you all for having me and for being here. I'm really excited to talk about this work. All right. So does anyone sort of recognize this picture here? You have here this border fence running along sort of the middle of the screen. On the right side is the city of Tijuana with really high levels of population concentration. And we think of these areas as being pretty filled with poverty. And on the left side is one of the detention facilities in San Diego. So it's sort of a nice or unfortunate sort of contradiction. And this presentation is actually part of a larger piece of my research agenda that looks at healthcare access, and overall well-being among migrants traveling across the U.S.-Mexico border. Today, I'll be presenting some co-authored work with my colleagues Stephanie Koning at the University of Wisconsin and Ana Martinez-Donate at Drexel University. Specifically, today, we'll be talking about we'll be looking at the health profiles of Mexican origin men who ultimately return to their country of origin. Just to provide an overview of where I'm going today, I want to highlight the relationship between one's health and the likelihood of migration, and I'll spend some time discussing exactly why this is really important. Then I'll investigate whether migrants who return to Mexico, either voluntarily or through deportation, are less healthy than those who remain in the U.S. Then I'll consider whether return migration might be driven by immigrants who have limited access to health care in the United States. And I'll spend a little time at the end of this talk thinking about sort of the implications this has for measurements of population inequality and just basic accounting of population health. Some background information for some of you who may not be too familiar with this population. Estimates from the American Community Survey, which is a segment from the census, estimates there are 11.7 million Mexican immigrants who are currently living in the U.S. And of the entire foreign-born population, Mexicans represent 28%. So this is a sizable, non-trivial proportion of all immigrants. Right? And in addition to highlighting sort of the stocks that exist, it's also important to consider the flows of migrants, so those traveling across borders, right? So between 2009 and 2014, 1 million Mexican origin adults and children who were residing in the US actually returned to Mexico. So these are people who are going back to their country of origin. During the same period, we have 870,000 Mexican immigrants who resided in Mexico and made the decision to journey to the US. So based on this brief snapshot, it really suggests that more Mexican migrants are actually leaving the US than migrating to the US. So this might be a little surprising for some of you who aren't, again, too familiar with this work. And what's pretty fascinating about the Hispanic population, and Mexicans in particular, is that they fare better on a number of health indicators, relative both to native-born Mexican individuals as well as native-born whites. Right? So just a quick preview, Mexican immigrants experience lower mortality rates, they're less likely to smoke, they're less likely to use alcohol or drugs, they're less likely to be obese. And they're also less likely to suffer from chronic conditions like diabetes, heart disease, and so forth. And sort of on that same note, Mexican immigrants report higher consumptions of fruits and vegetables, they tend to report healthier diets, and they have better overall self-reported health. And this type of favorable health advantage has somewhat shocked scholars who study the relationship between socioeconomic status and health. Many people find it pretty implausible that Mexicans, and especially undocumented Mexicans, could have such good health given their relatively low levels of educational attainment, given that they tend to earn low wages, and that they tend to have poor English ability. So because we know that higher SES individuals tend to report better health on a variety of outcomes, and across a variety of contexts, we see this patterning across many places. How can we reconcile this mismatch between low levels of resources that are prevalent in the Mexican community, given that they have such excellent health levels? So this is sort of a mismatch, right? Oh, I should add, if anyone has questions, I do better if someone just sort of interrupts me. It's always a little disconcerting talking to a completely quiet room. Okay. So there's a lot of explanations for why this Hispanic paradox might exist. The first surrounds data quality, and the argument is that Mexicans, especially older Mexicans, are more likely to systematically misreport their ages. So this makes it look as though they have higher life expectancies, but this is just an artifact of error and misreporting. Recent work suggests, though, that this isn't actually what's going on, so there's been less investment on this particular explanation. The second surrounds this idea of protective culture, and the argument is that there's something really unique about Mexican culture that yields more benefits that ultimately translates to their health outcomes. So this might include things like greater levels of social support, more family orientation that is likely to help be a protective factor in their health. And there's fairly weak evidence for this perspective, but more work definitely needs to test this out. Finally, this is what I'll be concentrating on. This third perspective argues that the health advantage is the result of selective migration processes, right? And this means that Mexican migrants are not representative of individuals who reside in Mexico, right? They're going to fundamentally differ from non-migrants in some really important ways. And the literature does acknowledge this in social sciences, including sociology, economics, population health. And immigrants generally tend to be more motivated than non-migrants. They tend to display higher levels of ability, and they have different skill sets than non-migrants. So in this case, I'm referring to Mexican individuals who ultimately will migrate to the US versus Mexican residents who are never migrants. And in the context of migration and health, the healthy migrant hypothesis and the Salmon bias are two explanations for how exactly this health-related migration is likely to occur. So the healthy migrant hypothesis argues that immigrants are likely to have better health than non-migrants, right? So this might be because there's substantial physical requirements that are needed to make the journey across international borders, right? It could also be, though, that health is correlated or associated with other traits that ultimately sort of induce or increase the likelihood of migration. So we think about perhaps health being correlated with a certain level of educational attainment, which is in fact the driver of migration. So this last piece is a sort of indirect effect of health. The salmon bias hypothesis, and this is specifically what I'll be examining today, argues that once immigrants have settled in the United States, those who are disproportionately unhealthy are more likely to return to Mexico. And this is named after the phenomenon of salmon who return to their place of birth to eventually die. It's an optimistic hypothesis. So it could be that health is a direct influence for return, but we might also see evidence of indirect sort of relationships here, right? It could be that less successful migrants who happen to have worse health ultimately make the decision to return to Mexico. And it's important to sort of note that both of these hypotheses are not mutually exclusive, right? We could have both of them occurring at the same time, where we have healthier individuals who migrate from Mexico to the US. At the same time, we could have the less healthy who have settled in the US returning. So we could see these flows occurring simultaneously. Generally, the work for healthy, or the evidence rather, for the healthy migrant hypothesis is fairly weak and inconsistent. And there is a growing scholarship that argues that there is in fact some evidence to suggest salmon bias is indeed occurring. So some of the more rigorous studies find that mortality rates are in fact higher among return migrants, and especially Mexican immigrants. And a few studies have also found that return migrants from the US to Mexico report worse self-reported health and more chronic conditions. So again, things like heart disease and diabetes. It's important to note here, and I'll come back to this when sort of at the end of the talk, these studies certainly have helped our understanding of salmon bias, and they definitely contribute to existing evidence. But they often survey migrants well after they've made the return journey back to Mexico, and a number of years after settlement has occurred, right? And if you think that the consequences of the return journey, along with the change in environment, the resettlement process, if you're likely to believe those things influence health, these conclusions are really going to misstate the extent to which salmon bias occurs, right? And I'll talk a little bit more later about sort of ideal timing in which to measure health in this process. So, okay, let's say we believe that salmon bias is in fact true, though. What could be driving these patterns, right? One possibility is this idea of medical returns. And it's this idea that less healthy migrants are returning to Mexico specifically to seek medical care. We know that amongst disadvantaged populations, especially among the undocumented, healthcare in the US is largely inaccessible or just very inaffordable. And there is a growing research that acknowledges that Mexican migrants who live near the border cross over to receive medical care. And so, this is very much likely occurring if we believe this relationship between return migration and health. And given that Mexico has instituted universal health care in 2012, it's very possible then that this health-related return is really being driven by the need to seek medical care. And we'll focus on this particular piece in analyses. It could also be, of course, the case that the economic incentives for remaining in the US are going to decline, right? If you're in poorer health, you might have you may be unable to work, or you may not work as many hours as you would like, right? So they might, in this case, less healthy migrants may decide to return to seek other forms of employment, or just because the incentives are no longer outweighing the costs of being in a foreign land. Right. Finally, it could very well be that those in poor health just want family-based care. They want to be reunited with their loved ones during a particularly difficult time, right? And these three sort of explanations aren't necessarily exhaustive of all possible scenarios, but there are some of the most intuitive, at least in my mind, or straightforward ways of thinking about the factors that could be driving salmon bias. Any clarification questions thus far? So, what about forced migration, right? These three sort of explanations I propose really implicitly assume that there's this voluntary decision of going back to Mexico, right? Given that, well, in the case of deportation, we no longer have individual decision-making factoring into decisions, right? We have large outside societal and institutional forces that are likely resulting in changing migration flows. Okay. So here is a graph that I have borrowed from the Department of Homeland Security, and it shows the number of removals in thousands from 2004 to 2013. And the different shades of blue represent different types of removals. That's really not my particular concern here. Just, I want you to focus your attention on that thick, bold line. So in 2004, there were about 250,000 removals from the US. And this is just all removals, not a particular country. And you see this sort of steep increase, a slight leveling, and another uptick. And so in 2013, about 450,000 forced removals. So this essentially doubled during this pretty narrow time span. What's really remarkable is across all of these years, Mexican immigrants accounted for about 70% of all removals. So they're really overrepresented in this population. So what does this mean substantively, or what could this mean? So given, yeah?
I was wondering if you had data on how many immigrants are actually coming in or are in. So do you think that this is a trend that's going up, or do you think that there's some sort of stable percentage of like, okay, well in 2014 we've got all these deportations. However, there are, 10 times more immigrants that have settled here.
Yeah, so per capita, like if you account for fluctuations in the migrant population, we're still seeing that increase in deportations. So it's not just an artifact of sort of increases population means increasing numbers of deportees. But no, that's a great question. All right, so given that we have this really steep increase of deportees, right? It's possible that the process of deportation itself is changing the health composition of migrant flows. So on the one hand, right, if you think that a larger number of deportees might mean that the composition of those who return to Mexico is more diverse. So maybe you think by increasing the number of deportees, you're just going to get a more diverse population, right? You're just sort of casting a wider net. If you think this is the case, then the act of deportation is going to reduce health selection with respect to salmon bias. And it's really going to we're going to see an understatement of the extent to which the Hispanic health advantage occurs. This is a little tricky to think about, but bear with me here. On the other hand, if you think that regardless of the massive amounts of deportation that are occurring, if you think that deportation targets less advantaged people, then we're going to get a pretty homogeneous composition or group of deportees, right? And in this case, we would really, our estimates of the Hispanic health advantage would really be overstated in this particular scenario. And so the overall argument is that we're trying to make is that by not accounting for deportation, it's really sort of messing with our estimates of the levels of Hispanic health as well as the differences between the health of Hispanics and native-born whites. Right, so this is going to be something really important to consider. Okay. So just to outline our objectives or questions, we test whether return migrants are less healthy than those who remain in the U.S., and we adjudicate between voluntary return migrants and deported migrants. We also ask a pretty closely related question, but it's going to be distinct. We ask whether health predicts the likelihood of returning to Mexico, sort of net of socio-demographic and exposure to U.S. society. So this is sort of a more, sort of digs into the independent effects of health on return. And then we just ask if access to medical care in the United States is likely to really increase return amongst the least healthy individuals. So to really get at these questions, we have to pool data from two sources. The first is what we call the Migrante survey, and this is a sample of return and deported migrants. The second survey is the California Health Interview Survey, or the CHIS, and here we are using this survey to represent our population of stayers, and this requires a little bit of explanation. First, let's talk a little bit about the Migrante study. It's a cross-sectional health study. It was conducted in 2013 along the Tijuana-San Diego border region. And this is a really popular port of entry and arrivals. Of all U.S.-Mexico crossings, 40% take place at this particular location. We use a multi-stage, multi-site sampling strategy that's modeled after the EMIF. The English translation is the Survey of Migration at Mexico's Northern Border, and this is the study that really looks at the socio-demographic factors of migrants who cross borders. So it was modeled after that. And the Migrante, we're able to identify 4 possible migration flows. For the purpose of this paper, we rely on 2. The first is migrants who have lived in the U.S., and they had to be living in the U.S. for at least 30 days to ensure they weren't just sort of traveling or engaged in very temporary migration. So they could come from California, Arizona, Texas, they could come from anywhere in the U.S. And we surveyed them at the Tijuana border. Right? So these are people who have lived in the U.S. for X amount of years, and they are returning to Mexico. The other flow that we're interested in are migrants who, again, were living in the U.S. for X number of years, and again, they could be in any state, and were forcibly deported back to Mexico, a detention facility in Tijuana. So the response rates were much higher for the deported population, which perhaps isn't entirely surprising, but we have 68% when we combine both flows. And respondents were sampled in the airport, the major central bus station, and one of the major deportation facilities in Tijuana. So for our information on migrant stayers, if you will, we used the CHIS data from 2011 and 2012. And this was a statewide sample of migrants residing in California. A telephone survey was conducted, and we both had landline and cell phones. So this was sort of nice given the current culture of declining landline use. And 1 individual per household was randomly selected. So from this CHIS data, we get our group, our comparison group, right? We have our sample of Mexican immigrants who are currently residing in the US. So our outcome is going to be the type of your migrant status, if you will. So using the Migrante data, we create two dichotomous outcomes, whether respondents are voluntarily returning to Mexico, and our other is whether respondents experience deportation. For both groups, our reference category are those CHIS respondents, Mexican stayers who remain in the US at the point of survey. So there's a lot of ways that you could measure health. We do this in a number of ways. We first look at self-reported health. So migrants are asked, would you say that in general your health is excellent, good, good, excellent, very good, good, fair, or poor? We also look at a variety of other health indicators, like the presence of health limitations, whether they have been diagnosed with diabetes, hypertension, heart disease, and whether they are obese. And we also were interested in looking at indicators of mental health, something that's fairly absent in the literature. And so we look at the frequency to which migrants report feeling sad, they had a lot of energy, or were pretty depressed all or most of the time. Right. And when we test whether health is going to independently influence return migration, we control for measures that are likely correlated with both health status and with migration, right? So these include things like their age, whether they had lived in an urban area. We look at the presence of children as well as their educational attainment. Well, it's also really important to think about indicators that are related to exposure to US society, right? So things like whether they speak English, whether in fact they are a naturalized citizen. That is only going to appear for our voluntary return migrants, since that you cannot deport naturalized citizens thus far. And we have measures of duration of stay. So we use logistic regression to predict the probability of return, and we're going to run separate specifications for voluntary and deported samples. And we repeat this exercise with the inclusion of our control variables to really see if health is going to influence the probability of return after we control for these important characteristics. So ultimately, we restricted our analyses to Mexican-born males, and this was something that we had really struggled with. So the migration process is fundamentally different for men and women. They have these different experiences. There's differences in social networks and sort of the just various characteristics for men and women. So that was one of the main reasons for limiting our analyses to males. The other, however, is a little more data-driven in that the deportation process is something that's really gendered, with men being dramatically overrepresented in the deported population. So recent estimates were that 51% of the undocumented population are men, but they make up about 90% of the deported population. So this is something that's really sort of male-centered. And we use multiple imputation by migrant flow to account for missing data. Okay. So this approach, in order to pool these two data sets with some conviction, we have to rely on a couple of assumptions and beliefs, right? The first is that our sample of stayers from the CHIS and our sample of migrants are representative of their respective populations, right? And this is something that we're able to test, and you'll see some evidence that in fact we're pretty convinced we do a fairly good job at this. The next is that we really need to focus our energy and analyses on question and answer items that are similar or identical in both surveys, right? We don't want to we want to ensure we're measuring the same constructs, that people are responding in the same ways. The other issue is we need to make sure that the composition of movers and stayers is pretty stable over time. We don't want to introduce a lot of compositional shifts in our estimates. And we do this by using these two data sets that are taken about a year apart, but we also include things like controlling for duration and age to hopefully alleviate some of these concerns. All right, let's see some data. Okay, here are just a couple of selected descriptive statistics. I know I always go nuts when people show me 1,000 cells and expect me to see what's going on. All right. The first two columns are from our Migrante data, the voluntary return flow and our deported flow. And this right side column represents our CHIS data, or our population of stayers. Okay. A couple of things to notice here. We see a higher percentage of voluntary return and deported migrants who report having excellent and very good health. And we also see that both flows report feeling more frequent stress and sadness compared to migrants who remain in the US. We also see that fewer stayers report not having health insurance in the past 12 months. So this is perhaps intuitive, but important to sort of lay the groundwork here. Okay. So now we just ask whether there's any evidence for this salmon bias. Right. I'm going to show you a couple of different things. So first, here are results from two separate logistic regressions, and voluntary return migrants and deported migrants are both compared to stayers. And to help with interpretation here, I'm actually going to show you things on the predicted probability scale. I think it's a lot more intuitive than looking at odds ratios. Okay. So here we are looking at the predicted probability of return by each of these 5 categories of health status, ranging from excellent, very good, good, fair, and poor. And this is only for voluntary migrants. And, you know, it's somewhat surprising that voluntary migrants in better health are more likely to return to Mexico than those in poor health. Specifically, if we compare those in excellent health, they're more likely to return to Mexico by 18 percentage points compared to individuals in poor health. And it's also fairly interesting that the predicted probability of return, we see sort of this dosage effect, if you will, where it declines steadily at each sort of level or category of health. So this isn't really what we would expect if salmon bias was occurring. All right. So now we look at deported migrants, and they are the red columns. We see pretty similar patterns for this population, right? One thing that's fairly interesting to note is that voluntary migrants in relatively poorer health are actually more likely to return than the deported population who shares their particular health status. So what this might suggest, at least when I look at this and think about it, is that the relationship between health and deportation is even stronger than it is for voluntary return. And again, this isn't something that we would expect necessarily if salmon bias was occurring. Okay. So we also look at a number of chronic health conditions as well as health limitations, just in case you weren't really convinced that self-reported health was the most accurate way to go, right? So I'm just going to show you some selected results here. First, let's go through the voluntary migrants. So those who experience health limitations and high levels of stress have a 6% and an 18 percentage points, they're more likely to return than those who don't have health limitations or who are not highly stressed. right? And so this starts to sort of align with what we believe about salmon bias, that less healthy migrants are in fact more likely to return. But to complicate things, when you look at chronic conditions, here I've pointed out diabetes and heart disease, these migrants who have these conditions are significantly less likely to return. And, you know, this isn't necessarily what we would expect, but it is important to keep in mind that things like diabetes and heart disease, they require some type of medical diagnosis and require sort of access to health. So we may be looking at sort of an underestimate of diabetes, chronic conditions, because this population tends to be fairly disadvantaged with respect to healthcare access. All right. So with deported populations, we see really, really similar results. The one thing that's fairly striking, though, is that those who report feeling high levels of sadness or depression are significantly more likely to return. But, you know, it's likely that that deportation process itself, the act of being deported, is likely driving a lot of these mental health disparities, right? So it's not as though deportation targets really sad individuals. It's likely that the process is generating these sort of higher levels of stress and sadness. So now we ask sort of a closely related question, right? Whether health is going to independently influence that probability of return. So what happens? I don't want to show you too many charts and graphs. It gives me a headache. So what happens is our findings are pretty robust to the inclusion of all of these sort of control variables, right? Especially for self-reported health, mental health, and chronic conditions. The direction, the magnitude, and significance really persists. So it really does suggest that the influence of health on migration is fairly independent, at least with respect to the variables we have in our analyses. And it's not central to our question, but it is interesting that migrants with higher levels of education, migrants who are married, those who are non-citizens, who have been in the US for longer than 2 years, and who speak English are less likely to return to Mexico. And I'm happy to elaborate later or now if anyone has questions about this non-citizen piece. All right. So the final thing we look at is if this process of medical returns could possibly be driving voluntary migration. Right? So specifically what we do here is we interact whether respondents are uninsured with we interact the respondent's health insurance with their presence of health limitations, right? So this is going to allow us to see if return migration is driven by individuals who are uninsured and who have poor health. So what we expected is that this return should be most likely among those in poor health without health insurance, right? If the idea was that migrants who are comparably ill are likely to return for these healthcare reasons, right? This is what we'd expected. Results are fairly weak for this, actually. So the probability of return is only marginally higher, 5.5 percentage points higher, for those who have health limitations and who do not have insurance. So this is fairly weak evidence for the idea that migrants are returning specifically to seek medical care. Yeah.
Is that combining across the voluntary migrants and the deported?
Yeah, thank you for clarifying. So this is only for voluntary migrants, since deported migrants can't be going home for medical care, right? It's an involuntary choice. Thanks. So this is only for voluntary, and we don't see a whole lot of evidence, and we'll talk about this in a second. All right. So discussion, and I'll also run through a couple of sensitivity checks here. Okay. So we find mixed evidence for salmon bias. On the one hand, we see that return migrants are more likely to report high levels of stress. We see that they're more likely to report health limitation than stayers, and we see this for both voluntary returns and deported populations. However, they're less likely to report poorer overall health, this idea of self-reported health, and they're less likely to report chronic conditions. So what this might suggest is that particular health conditions, or health conditions generally, don't equally influence migrants' decisions to return. So perhaps there's something about chronic conditions that don't necessarily induce return migration, right? Perhaps these are manageable for some people, and so we don't see this pattern of health-related return migration, right? And alternately, just poorer overall health limitations might really induce immigrants to go back home. But again, this could also be due to sort of an underestimate of these chronic conditions because so many of these populations don't have access to medical care. So, I'd like to hear your thoughts about maybe what might be exactly going on or how to better test at this assertion. We also find that the relationship between health and return is really robust to these control variables that we look at. Right? When we look at sociodemographic characteristics and exposure to U.S. society, the relationship, the magnitude does not change. And we also find, as I just mentioned, that migrants who are not insured are more likely to, return to Mexico, and the probability of return is slightly higher for those who have health limitations, but it was really small. It was a difference of 5 percentage points. I'm not really ready to get really excited about that at this point. Okay, so what this could mean is that perhaps salmon bias doesn't necessarily operate through this process of medical returns. Perhaps it's more about family reunification, or it's maybe more about the declining incentives as opposed to healthcare itself. Or it could be that we need to really target better measures for healthcare. So maybe it's not the presence or absence of insurance, but maybe their preferences for specific types of care or the quality of care that they perceive that they're receiving, right? So these are all things that we should probably think about. Okay, so some of you may be wondering, because I gave a little overview of the evidence on salmon bias, and so some people have in fact found that less healthy are likely to return, and our study provides fairly mixed evidence. So what on earth is going on? There's a couple of things that we've considered. So remember I mentioned that this past work on salmon bias really looks at the health of Mexican immigrants well after they've returned, after they've settled in their communities back in Mexico. And so when they do this, what happens is that when their health is measured at this time, this is both a function of their health status prior to migration, as well as the changes in their health status that are specifically because their location has changed, because of the consequences of migration. And so our data really tries to get at this timing issue by measuring the second migrants are crossing over. So we think this is an improvement. It helps alleviate some of these concerns. The other, of course, is that our data might be sort of over-representing or under-representing certain populations, and so I'll get to this in a second. So we also find that migrants in better physical health are at a higher risk for deportation. So this has begged some interesting questions about what it means that we're deporting some of our healthiest residents in the United States. And it very well could be that deportation is selecting on traits that are just correlated with better health, right? So you've heard stories, especially recently, where there's a lot of raids on places of employment, right? And especially in construction, agricultural work. And it's likely that these migrants who are working in these really difficult physical conditions just might have better health, and this is why we're seeing that relationship. Substantively, for sort of demographers, for people who are interested in population health, believe it or not, the health advantage that we see among Hispanic populations would actually be a lot greater in the absence of deportation. So by deporting the more physically capable individuals, it's really creating sort of a muting effect of this health advantage. So something important to think about. And a slightly piece of depressing news is that about exactly 49.2% of deportees had actually resided in the U.S. for 10 years or longer. And so it's perhaps not surprising that we see these really steep mental burdens that are associated with deportation. So it's not just people who have been here for a month or half a year. It's those who've established some type of family and root system. All right. So, we were a little worried about how, or the extent to which our study was sort of different from some of the conclusions reached by others. So we do a couple of sensitivity checks. Hopefully we could convince you that you buy our story. So what we do is we compare the health characteristics of our sample of stayers from the CHIS to the 2011 and 2012 NHANES study. And this is a large, nationally representative sample that focuses explicitly on health. And what we find is that our health characteristics of our sample and this sample generally overlap. So once you dig down to Mexican migrants who have been recent arrivals, we have pretty small sample sizes. That being said, our sample for CHIS migrants, they're just slightly older and they're more likely to experience heart disease. But otherwise, these differences are either fairly trivial or not statistically significant. So this provides some evidence that, in fact, we might be on the right track here. The Migrante study, right? Some of you might be more skeptical of exactly the types of populations this study is picking up on. So what we did, and we thought really hard about this, is we compared a particular characteristic in our data with the Mexican Migration Project. So we look at return migrants who have returned in 2013 in the Mexican Migration Project data. But remember, I made this big fuss about not being able to compare health characteristics well after migrants have returned, right? It's going to sort of confound our estimates. It's not going to give us what we want. So after a lot of thinking, waking up at 2 in the morning, we could use height. It's a relatively good indicator of adult health, and it's fixed. So, you're not going to lose a couple of inches by migrating back to your country of origin. Okay. So here we have height in inches. This dotted line represents our Migrante sample. The solid line is our Mexican Migration Project respondents. And we see that the distributions pretty much overlap, right? There's slightly more variation in our Mexican Migration Project, or in the Mexican Migration Project data. So it could be that our sample might be slightly healthier, although they're fairly similar, so I'm not ready to necessarily, anyway. All right, so what does this mean? Well, overall, the contributions are that the study looks at really vulnerable populations that are hard to measure with traditional methods of data collection, right? We don't collect information on people who leave the U.S. generally. It's really hard to get at the characteristics and health of deported migrants. So this is a step in the right direction. It's certainly not perfect, but we're getting there. And really, given the frighteningly high levels of mental distress amongst the deported populations, we should consider some additional support needed to address this, right? So whether it's having a counselor available at these detention facilities, including more mental health well-being and counselors along the border, this might partially remedy what's currently going on. And the main point is that studies that look at migration and health really need to bring to the forefront this process of deportation. They need to seriously consider how population changes are really influencing sort of our inferences that we can make and how these change, right? So the current estimates that we have are going to likely differ maybe from a study that's conducted 5 years from now, given the types of, or changes in deportation and the changes in people who decide to leave because the U.S. is no longer safe or savory, right? So all of these things are just things to think about. Right, thanks. Yeah.
Thank you. This is really interesting. When you interviewed both the voluntary and the deported migrants, did you have questions about whether or not they intended to stay in Mexico or whether they were planning on, reverse migrating back to the US?
So that's right. We could potentially be capturing cyclical migration flows, and we did not ask their intentions later. The trouble is, it's really hard to treat intentions as something that's sort of rooted in fact and truth, right? These things are always subject to change. But it would be great if we could sort of remain confident that they are going to remain in Mexico. One thing we did that's sort of related to your point is we were worried that maybe our sample of stayers in the CHIS, we had to make this pretty strong assumption that they were going to stay, that they aren't return migrants themselves. And so we limited our sample to stayers who, what did we do? Oh, we looked at the duration measure. So you had to be in the U.S. for at least 5 years because the average spell of migration is about 3.5 for Mexican immigrants at this point. And so we sort of wanted to make sure we were capturing the most likely pool of stayers. So we looked at those who had been in the U.S. for 5 years or longer, and the results don't budge. So slightly related, but...
So I'll ask. I have a couple questions.
Yeah.
One is, we've looked at that, the one item self-reported, subjective perception of health before, and it's really commonly used in a lot of medical studies and health studies. It's like the one question out there in a bunch of these kind of big national studies.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of problems with it. It's only one item.
Yeah.
And some of the previous studies that I remember, I thought it was actually that the Latino respondents were reporting slightly worse health in general than white populations. And there was a sense of well, maybe they're comparing it, or maybe they have worse expectations, or it's like, oh, I had a cold, so my health is really bad. Because when we look at all the other things like diabetes and heart disease and all that, they tend to be better off, right? So there's some doubt that was placed on their own personal reflection of rating their own health. So can you talk a little bit about that? It seems like you guys have thought about it a bit.
Yeah, so
with this sample.
There's a lot of, on the one hand, it's absolutely true that this measure of self-reported health is considered to be really reliable, and it's, you know, robust to all of these other factors. And if you do analyses, you know, all of you know, people are pretty good at evaluating their health, right? Some of the issues that I've seen, and I can't, you know, with confidence say that this is 100% the case, that there's issues with translation when you interview individuals in Spanish and in English. And so this is something I'm currently fighting with in another paper that's related, is that the categories in English are generally, you know, excellent, very good, good, fair, or poor. And in many of the historical surveys in Mexico, there's actually more negative categories. So it goes from very good to regular to poor to very poor. And so the change in response categories is probably somewhat what's driving that disparity between the health among Latino populations and whites. And another is absolutely the case that, you know, it's all about your reference categories, right? So if you see, you know, your cousins and friends who are all partying or working and you're not feeling all that well, you might think that your health is relatively poor compared to those who you surround yourself by. But we did have those concerns, so we looked at those other measures of chronic illness, and those, of course, aren't perfect because they require some type of official diagnoses, or, you know, obesity might be a broad, good measure of physical fitness, but now we're learning of all of these issues surrounding measures of BMI and actual fitness. And so we've just tried to be as broad as possible while still remaining somewhat theoretically grounded on this issue. But did you have a follow-up?
Oh, well, my other question was, you know, you alluded to the family reunification or family formation processes that may be intersecting with all of this. And although you didn't report any of the data today, I was wondering if you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah. So a report from the Pew Research Center, which is one of the preeminent studies organizations that looks at Mexican health, actually released a report a few months ago, and they did a convenient sample, I believe, and I can't speak to the details, but a high percentage of return migrants were motivated by family reunification. And we have seen evidence that in our data, if the migrants have children, they are much more likely to return. And so we think that this is a really powerful the presence of children is a really powerful sort of predictor of not only your desire to return, but perhaps the necessity to go back and provide for your kid.
So if they have a child in Mexico?
Yeah, so if they have a child in Mexico, they're much more likely to return to Mexico than bring that child here. Perhaps because the crossing of borders now is quite dangerous. So it's really interesting stuff.
Do you think some of them are going back also maybe to take care of their own parents? Because then they themselves might be older to go back to take care of elderly parents?
Yeah, we should look at that. That's a great idea.
Because then that would affect the health too, right?
Yeah.
Because if they themselves are older, then they may have more of these kind of chronic health issues, or that would definitely affect the mortality rates in the U.S. side.
No, that's absolutely right. And I had a wonderful thought, and it just popped out of my head.
Sort of related, but I'm just curious now about the salmon bias hypothesis. Has it been supported in other migrant groups?
Excellent question. So people have looked pretty exclusively amongst Hispanic and Mexican populations. The one study that I know of looks at salmon bias within China, so amongst internal migrants who sort of cross the rural-urban lines, and there has been some support for salmon bias. And I take that back. There's also evidence for it using Social Security data in Sweden. So we see, and Sweden has really good records, which is why demographers tend to love it. And yeah, you do see evidence that the mortality slopes for people from Sweden who ultimately return are a lot more steep.
Do you have any data for all the voluntary migrants that enter U.S.? Do you capture data on the reason why they're entering the U.S.? Like sort of going back to what Mary brought up, that if they are going to go back for family reunification, is it sort of that they're meant to bring back sort of more financial support? Is it that what sort of, so do you capture the entrance data?
No, we don't, unfortunately. One of our flows, the ones I didn't talk about, does look at migrants who are coming from southbound or other more southern states in Mexico who have intentions of coming to the U.S. And so we're working on that data now, and we do ask the reason for migration, but the response to those categories are so absurdly low. I think only 10% of the sample wanted to mention their reason for entry, which might not be that surprising given privacy concerns or security, but of that really small sample, labor is the big one. It's not surprising. Yeah, and we're also making an assumption as well that, the majority of these are labor migrants, when they might not be, right? There's a growing number of males who are now tide movers with their spouse, and other, some are recruited by large companies specifically for their labor, but we don't really capture that, unfortunately. Yeah.
And the other question I have is, when you ask respondents about sadness or depression, was there sort of explanation or a follow-up of it? Because oftentimes there are cultural factors in mental health is perceived and reported.
Yeah,
So
that's a great question. So the exact wording was, in the past 4 weeks, how often have you felt more stressed than usual? And the answer categories were all of the time, a lot of the time. So we combined those for our stress measure, and the rest are some, very infrequently, I'm paraphrasing that one, and never. So, ideally it would be great, and using the Migrante data, we were able to create a scale to try to reduce measurement error to get more reliability. The problem is that a lot of the items in that battery didn't match to that other data set, our sample of stayers. And so it felt wrong to sort of force these categories to really work within that scale. So we kind of sacrificed, a little more integrity, and possibly we might be introducing a little bit of measurement error by sort of foregoing that type of scale.
Did you have any information on the deportees, how long they might have been incarcerated in the U.S. or held, or is there any information on that?
I find it hard to believe that we wouldn't have that. For some reason, I had not thought about that. But that would be really, really important, because, it's likely that the time that you spent incarcerated is really going to mess with your health, and so you're going to see, as things currently stand, on average, they have better physical health, but their mental health is really, really shoddy, and the longer that they are in these scenarios, you're likely to see that magnification of poor mental health. Yeah.
I know you found a bit of support
and also anxiety. Are there any questions that you have that elaborate on what those reasons are for high stress and anxiety?
We don't. So
Like, is that lack of building social support in the U.S. Going back? They're like voluntarily wanting to go back.
let's see. We have, I believe it's these data, we have measures of perceived discrimination, which would probably really be important, right?
Stress.
For both stress and health, right? There's a growing literature that looks at minorities' perceived or real discrimination, and that this really works to increase, hypertension. It increases mental health issues, and so, no, that's a fabulous idea that maybe we really need to look for alternate measures, right? And not just solely attribute these levels of anxiety to a particular migration flow, but maybe thinking just a little more carefully about where that comes from.
Well, I want to thank Dr. Diaz. If there's no other questions, I think really interesting and really
Thanks.
relevant work for our, location here on the U.S.-Mexico border and the populations that we're looking at to help us understand, how family stays and human development might be shaped by these kind of factors. So,
Great. Well, thank you for having me. Thanks for your questions. Thank you for those.